you don't turn money away. That's just not what you do. You can be selective about whose money you take, but you don't turn money away when you already have an investor in your pool. And so we put these scorecards together and we included our organization's values, contributions to entrepreneurs, and we also looked at representation when we did. And over the course of 2 years, we actually changed the composition of who our investor base was. We eliminated investors who didn't meet our standard, many of whom did come from dominant groups and were essentially resting on their laurels in terms of the money they contributed rather than what they did to help grow our portfolio companies. And in the meantime, I was empowered to go and seek out investors who were coming from other social identity groups.
Melting Pot, a global podcast series hosted by Payal, connects guests who have inspiring stories and reaches out to a multicultural audience over 52 countries. Guests are diverse, such as celebrities, entrepreneurs, travelers, and many more who've had a turning point in their lives and moved over to a holistic lifestyle. Follow us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, social media. Hi everyone, today I am in conversation with Alida Miranda Wolff. Alida is a leader in D&I and belonging. She's dedicated to teaching love and fostering unity to help people reach their full potential. She's the founder and CEO of Ethos, which is a pioneering DEIB firm. She's been instrumental in creating secure, optimistic environments through innovative learning design, consulting, and inclusive communication. I also have to add here that Alida is a fellow podcaster like me. And her podcast is called Care Work Podcast, which she launched in 2018. And I was happy to have, as I was mentioning to her before we started the conversation, I did listen to a couple of the episodes. And of course, I will want to learn more about the podcast from you, Alida. But I have to, this lady is inspiring because she's also a published author. So thank you so much for joining me today, Alida.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so excited.
Okay, Alida, let's start by asking you about your background. So that's the first part of my question. And then also what actually inspired you to start Ethos, and how did your personal journey lead you to focus on diversity, inclusion, and equity? Or rather the other way around, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
The answer to that question or series of questions is all interlinked. So the place that I like to start is I have been focused on and interested in belonging my entire life because I've never belonged anywhere. And that comes from a few different places. So first of all, I am part of the Cuban diaspora. My family moved from Cuba to Spain and then to the US. And so there's this element of inherited placelessness, of not really being from one place in particular. And that's something that my mom carries and has carried with her throughout her life as somebody who left Cuba at the age of 10 and then Spain at the age of 19. But then there's also the element that before I was 16 years old, I moved 11 times. And that meant for me that I really didn't have a hometown. I don't have childhood friends. I don't have a lot of these connections to place, which is where a lot of people find a sense of belonging. And then there's just the element that in the US in particular, there are very black and white definitions of what puts somebody in a group or not. So even though the term Latina exists only in the US because it refers to people coming from all over Latin America who live here, there is a very specific conception of what a person is supposed to look like and sound like if they're in that group. Of course, that does not apply to the reality, considering how many different types of people come from Latin America. But I have always been considered to be white, as if there's no such thing as a white Hispanic person, which is not the case. And so that's meant that I haven't really been part of the Latina group, But I also haven't really culturally been part of this group, this amorphous group of white people either, because what white means in the US is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and developed, the acronym WEIRD. And a lot of the cultural indicators just don't apply to me. I didn't grow up in environments like that. I was in primarily Spanish speaking environments and communities. I didn't speak English until I was 5. And even to this day, many idioms I don't understand or frequently say incorrectly because it just wasn't part of my cultural context. The sense of not really belonging to one group extended past, though, this Latina identity. So I am a person with disabilities. Most of my disabilities are invisible. So I pass in different groups. And it was when I was at university that I understood these challenges in a more explicit way because I was in a car accident. I shattered my left side. I had to use assistive technology to move around. And all of a sudden, I went from feeling very included in my community to not being wanted in that community while I had
What
physical.
what was the reason for that? Because like it was no fault of yours that you were in an accident and then you had a physical disability as a result of that, but that did not identify you or change you as a person.
But there comes, and this shows up in the disability justice community, there comes a stigma when you have physical disabilities and the sense that you are inconvenient. So the two examples that show up for me the most during this time are one, I was in a classroom setting where I needed to use a tablet because I couldn't write because my arm was in a sling. I had no ability to write with a pen and paper. I was using voice to text and I was using a tablet. And even though I had a doctor's note, even though I had special approval from the university, my professor said that it was distracting and that made other students want to be able to use their devices and that she would prefer that I wasn't in her class. So that was an example. And then another example is when I transitioned from a wheelchair to crutches, I actually got trampled in the hallway going from one class to another because I was moving too slowly for people who were trying to get from one class to another within the 8-minute time frame. And so what I try to emphasize to folks about disability is so much of disability comes from the social expectations and whether the world is designed for people with disabilities rather than whether there's actually some impairment that they may have. The reality is, I performed while I was at university. And when I was able to use my tablet, I was a straight A student. And so the idea that I would be distracting to other students because I was using assistive technology, it wasn't really a reflection on me, but it was an inconvenience to my professor and the ideas that she had about what a good student would look like in her classroom. And this is something that people who have historically underrepresented or minoritized identities experience all the time. And so this made me think about the fragility of belonging because I had felt very much embedded in this community. And then I had another professor who said that she was skeptical that I could perform up to standard if I was coming out of an injury of the size that I was coming out of in her class, and that she would prefer if I dropped her class. Again, there are these assumptions, there are preconceived notions about what people can and can't do when they have disabilities. And then coming to this space formally, because I didn't know what this was called when I was in college, I worked first in industrial manufacturing and then transitioned into venture capital. And when I was in venture capital, that's when I came to the actual name, diversity, inclusion, specifically at the time, because this is many years ago. And I realized how in between I was because I was the first woman ever hired full time in my firm. I was the only Hispanic person working in venture capital in the city of Chicago, and I was the youngest person in my role nationally. All of these things set me apart. And on the one hand, people would be impressed that I had this role in this prestigious firm. On the other hand, there was this sense that I was an exception and that there must be a reason for that exception. And sometimes that reason would be more favorable. I was referred to as a unicorn. And other times I was on a panel once where I was talking about how to raise seed funding, and it was for women entrepreneurs. And one of the guests in the audience asked me the question, whose daughter are you that you could have this position? Which
Wow.
was really interesting for
Yeah.
me because I definitely acknowledge there's a lot of nepotism in the industry. It just didn't apply to me. And it was not how I had gotten my position. But there was this assumption that if I had this role, it had to be some kind of elite connection that had gotten me into it.
So, how do you measure the impact of your initiatives at Ethos?
We spend a lot of time thinking about metrics at Ethos, especially because we develop a lot of metrics for our clients specifically. What I like to start with is what is it that we are actually trying to measure? Because one of the, I think, pitfalls is we look to other organizations and how they set about their measurements to benchmark. And so we might say, based on the industry, this is what a good mix of diverse employees looks. And that doesn't make a lot of sense in practice, especially because many of these industries, their benchmarks are not things you want to live up to. Their representation numbers are low, and representation isn't everything, especially when you're not doing a lot of hiring. So, one of the things that we look at when we design an initiative is what actually are we achieve? And then we craft that metric. For example, if we are trying to promote advancement within an organization, we want to measure what not only the representation of folks at mid-level or senior level roles are, but what is their velocity of movement. So how quickly do they move relative to their peers? And how many opportunities do they have during that time to move laterally or to receive resources like mentorship or coaching? And so we won't just look at what is the percentage of folks who are coming into these roles, but how quickly do they move into these roles? And then what is the number of growth plans that are developed for them? How many of those growth plans are completed? What is their satisfaction with their own coach or mentor? And so that's how we start to design our metrics. And the key for us is to something that can be longitudinal. So once we measure it for 1 year, how do we measure it the next year and the next? So one of the examples that I can give, because the reports are all public, is we work with a digital innovation firm, and we have used the same baseline metrics for them since 2018. So we're able to see when there's been a change over time. And one of the changes we've been tracking is based on your social identity group, do you feel like you can provide two-way feedback within the organization? And this year was the first year that we saw a decline in those numbers. So that alerted us that there was something we needed to take a look at in the initiatives that were in place, in the state of the culture, in the state of the business, that we have employees who previously rated this as something that was high. No matter who you were, you felt that you could really engage in this feedback, but specifically those who identified as women and those who identified as queer were saying that they could not engage in two-way feedback in a safe way. So that's something that we want to be able to track so that we can see what's actually happening. And it's really important to measure longitudinally too, because outside factors always have an impact on inside of organizations. We're in an election year here in the US, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging has absolutely been a campaign issue. There are so many conservative activists who have turned it into a boogeyman and who are trying to essentially defang the programs and initiatives that have developed since 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, when a large majority of organizations started really investing in these things.
Yeah.
The result of their actions has been significant divestment in DEIB programs. But when we look at the data, 56% of American workers believe that DEIB should happen in their workplaces, which is about equivalent to what the sentiment was in 2020. So we're not seeing a significant decline in workers themselves wanting these initiatives to go away. What we're seeing is because we're in a politically contentious time, these initiatives are more at risk. And so being able to track what's happening has more than just the advantage of saying, how successful are we? How do we know if we're achieving what we want to achieve? But how are external pressures impacting the way that we achieve these things?
Okay. So let's move on to your podcast. And what encouraged you to start it? And what really is the basis of the show?
So care work really came about because I was interested in a central question, which is, what does it mean to get paid to take care of people for a living? And I was interested in this question for a few reasons. For one, as a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging practitioner, I found that I was doing a lot of emotional labor and caring labor. Basically, my job is to make sure that for the groups I advocate for, their needs are being met. And a lot of times I am the one meeting those needs. But when I was looking into what this meant, other than the economist Nancy Fulbright, who's written extensively on this idea of caring labor, most of the unified theories of care work are focused on healthcare, hospice, nursing, doctoring, therapy, and therapeutic services. But the reality of the situation is teachers, consultants, customer service professionals, flight attendants, all of these people are doing care work. And I wanted to be able to understand, what does it actually mean? Because we talk about living in a knowledge economy where people are primarily knowledge workers, and as opposed to doing a trade, maybe they did 100 years ago, their trade is knowledge. And as we continue to explore AI and continue expanding our reliance on data, what I see is a shift from being knowledge workers to care workers. And so, what does that actually mean? How do we actually take care of people in ways that make sense for them? And also, how do we take care of ourselves? Because this is somewhat uncharted territory. There's secondary trauma that comes with taking care of others. There are all kinds of boundaries that are violated. There's also just, this is a space where it's really ripe for exploitation. When you care for someone, the transaction of money is much more complicated. It's one of the reasons that teachers find it so hard to strike, because they're not just thinking about advocating for their rights or their students' rights, but what happens to their students if they themselves are not in the classroom with them. Yeah. So there are all of these complicated pieces that I thought could be really interesting to explore. But there was also the fact that the idea came to me while I was on parental leave, and I was spending pretty much every waking moment trying to breastfeed and thinking about what it meant to have a human being who was reliant on me for their food source and who could not survive without me. And so I put this mock-up of the show together. And as I've now completed 4 seasons, one of the things that I found just so motivational about it is, by talking to all of these different people in different fields and for different arcs, I've been able to learn what care means in a much broader way. And also, for me personally, things that I need to be doing to better take care of myself.
Yeah. Interesting. And you started this in 2018, right?
2022.
Oh, 22. Okay. So 2018 was Ethos, and
yes,
Care Work was 2022. Okay. What are some practical steps that you think the viewers and listeners can take to promote DE&I in their everyday lives and workplaces? Just something really simple, that a couple of steps that they could take would be great advice from you.
The simplest step that you can take is to actually go out of your way to form meaningful relationships from people who are different from you. And I know that sounds like a Hands Across America or United Colors of Benetton ad, but the reality of the situation is that we know that exposure is the number one solution to bias. The more that you are exposed to people who are coming from different cultures, different genders, different disabilities, different identities, the more likely you are to actually view them as people rather than in flat stereotypical terms that can then be used to divide. It's also important because, generally speaking, we live in a very lonely world. The data shows that in the Western world in particular, we are lonelier than we have ever been. And this is because we lack community and we lack a sense of connection to other people. So going out of our way to form relationships with people is the most important step. And I will reference Gerald Wing Su, who is one of the original scholars in this field, especially when talking about race. And he used to teach at Columbia. And when he taught at Columbia, he would ask his students, do you feel like you really engage with the local community? And they would say, yeah, we live in Harlem. Harlem is one of the most diverse parts of New York. And he would say, yeah, but do you know your bodega attendant? Do you go to music events with him? Do you actually connect with people in the community, or do you form bubbles among other students? Because ultimately that's the problem. Do you know the people around you, and do you take the time to develop relationships across those differences so that you have durable, meaningful relationships with them? It's not enough to do that to be an ally. I want to be clear. Allyship is both having a meaningful connection with someone who is coming from a minoritized group and actively advocating for them. You have to take both steps. But if you are doing that advocacy without having those relationships, it's very unlikely that your advocacy is actually going to achieve something that they desire. And if you only have the meaningful relationship, on an interpersonal level, there might be a lot to gain, but ultimately you're not moving the needle or using your own power to allow for them to share in that power.
Yeah, that's so true. Thank you so much, Alida. It's been wonderful listening to you. For a change, I haven't had to do much talking at all. So I really enjoyed listening to you and your perspective on DE&I and belonging. And good luck with Ethos, and I'll definitely be in touch with you. For more weekly conversations, do listen to Melting Pot on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. Follow us on YouTube and on Instagram at Podcast Melting Pot. So until the next episode, this is Payal signing off.